The arrival of change. St. Mary's General Hospital, a place known for its flawless reputation, sat nestled in the upscale neighborhood of Willowbrook. Every corner of its pristine lobby shimmered under gleaming chandeliers, casting a quiet, almost reverent glow. In this immaculate setting, Angela Parker was about to take her first steps into a world where every polished surface held secrets, and every shadow whispered of expectations that went unspoken. Angela straightened her shoulders as she entered, trying to ignore the way the icy air conditioning seemed to cut right through her. She could feel the weight of her mother's words echoing in her mind. "Hold your head high, Angela. You've worked hard, and you deserve to be there just as much as anyone else." Her mother had been right. Angela had toiled for years, graduating at the top of her class and facing an endless series of hurdles, all while navigating an industry where people like her were still a rare sight in certain spaces. The imposing marble walls and the distant hum of polished shoes on tiled floors seemed to close in around her. As she approached the reception desk, she caught the barely concealed glances cast her way by some of the staff. A quick appraisal, an evaluation, a hint of something unspoken but tangible. Steeling herself, Angela continued, her steps resolute. Angela approached the nurse's station, feeling her pulse quicken. "Excuse me," she said, summoning her most professional tone. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse. Could you direct me to the head nurse's office, please?" A slender blonde nurse glanced up, her gaze traveling over Angela before landing on her ID badge. "Third door down the hall, on your right," she replied with a smile that felt more polite than warm. Angela thanked her, heading down the hall, and feeling the weight of eyes on her back. She tried to push it aside. This wasn't her first time being the new face on a team, and she knew better than to read too much into initial impressions. Yet, the atmosphere here felt thick and charged, like a thunderstorm waiting to break. As she made her way toward the head nurse's office, she noticed a tall, distinguished man in a white coat emerge from a nearby patient room. His salt and pepper hair and the air of authority marked him as someone of significance. Summoning a hopeful smile, Angela approached him. "Good morning, doctor," she greeted, extending her hand. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse starting today." The man looked at her, his eyes sweeping over her in a brief but intense appraisal. His expression remained impassive as he nodded once. "Dr. William Greaves," he replied coolly, shaking her hand with an air of detachment. "I trust you're familiar with our standards here, Miss Parker. St. Mary's is not a place for mistakes." His tone was icy, almost dismissive, and he released her hand abruptly before walking away, leaving Angela standing alone in the hallway. She swallowed, her hand dropping slowly to her side. The excitement she'd felt that morning dimmed slightly, replaced by a prickling awareness that this would be no ordinary work environment. The head nurse's office loomed before her, a polished door with a gold-plated name tag reading Patricia Monroe, head nurse. Taking a steadying breath, Angela knocked and waited, her mind flashing back to her nursing school days. The late nights, the whispered doubts, the extra work she'd put in to prove herself, all of it had brought her to this moment. She couldn't afford to let the coldness of one doctor affect her. The door opened, and a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a stern expression regarded her. "Miss Parker," she said, her voice clipped. "Come in. Let's get you briefed." Angela entered, the sterile office lined with medical books and framed awards. She took a seat across from Patricia, who launched into a brisk orientation, laying out hospital policies and procedures with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Angela listened intently, nodding and absorbing everything. "Any questions?" Patricia asked, her gaze measuring Angela, as if waiting for her to slip up. "No, thank you. I'm ready to start," Angela replied, meeting her gaze with quiet confidence. Patricia nodded, a hint of approval in her eyes. "Good. Then let's get you set up with your assignments." The rest of Angela's first day was a whirlwind of paperwork, brief introductions, and a maze of hallways as she familiarized herself with the hospital's layout. She quickly noticed the subtle dynamics at play. The way conversations would dwindle to hushed tones when she approached, only to resume in murmured whispers after she passed by. It was as if her very presence disrupted some unspoken equilibrium. At the end of her shift, Angela was mentally exhausted. As she gathered her things from her locker, she overheard two nurses talking around the corner, their voices low but clear in the otherwise empty locker room. "Did you see the new nurse?" one whispered. "I don't know what they're thinking, hiring someone like that here." "Yeah, doesn't exactly fit the neighborhood, does she?" the other replied with a snicker. Angela's hand stilled on her locker door, her stomach twisting. She'd held out hope that the initial coolness was just nerves or unfamiliarity, but now the reality was sinking in. This wasn't just a new job. It was an uphill battle against prejudice and narrow-mindedness. Swallowing her disappointment, she closed her locker quietly and made her way to the bus stop, her mind swirling with frustration and a fierce determination to prove herself. As she waited for the bus, she pulled out her phone and dialed her mother's number. After 2 rings, a warm voice greeted her. "Hey, baby girl," her mother said, her voice soft and soothing. "How was your first day?" Angela took a shaky breath, fighting back tears. "It was challenging, Mama," she said, her voice barely a whisper. There was a pause on the other end of the line before her mother's familiar strength came through. "Angela Mary Parker, don't you let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. Remember, you're not just there for you. You're there for every little black girl who dreams of being in those halls one day." Angela closed her eyes, letting her mother's words ground her. "I know, Mama," she said quietly. "It's just harder than I expected." "Nothing worth doing is ever easy," her mother replied firmly. "But you're strong, Angela. Hold your head high, do your job better than anyone else, and don't let them see you falter." "Yes, Mama," Angela replied, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. As she ended the call, she noticed a sleek black car pulling up to the curb. Through the tinted window, she glimpsed Dr. Greaves. He looked at her, his gaze cool and appraising, before the car sped off. Angela stood taller, her mother's words echoing in her mind. She may be facing an uphill battle, but she was far from alone. Her family's strength, her own resolve, and the quiet resilience that had seen her through so much already, these would be her armor against whatever challenges lay ahead. As she boarded the bus, she knew she would return to St. Mary's with her head held high, ready to confront the biases lurking in its hallowed halls. Little did she know that her presence would soon trigger a reckoning, forcing those who saw only her appearance to confront their own prejudices in a way that would shake the institution to its core. The hidden power in room 209. Angela Parker arrived at St. Mary's the next morning with a sense of quiet determination, bracing herself against the chilly autumn air. Her mother's words from the night before still echoed in her mind, grounding her, reminding her of the purpose behind her work. Today, she was ready to face whatever challenges awaited her, and she would not be intimidated by the judgmental whispers or cold stares. As she entered the hospital and headed toward the nurse's station, Angela noticed an elderly man seated by himself in the waiting area, his face half hidden beneath a baseball cap. He was observing everything around him with a keen eye. Most patients tended to look lost, either in their thoughts or on their phones, but this man seemed alert. Angela made a mental note to check on him later, assuming he was a family member waiting for someone. She greeted her colleagues with a quiet nod, receiving the same guarded responses in return. The head nurse, Patricia Monroe, caught sight of her and gestured for Angela to approach. "Good morning, Miss Parker," Patricia said briskly, adjusting her glasses as she glanced over a clipboard. "You'll be assisting Dr. Greaves today with patient care in room 209. He has a list of tasks prepared for you." Angela suppressed a sigh. Dr. William Greaves. His treatment of her the previous day had been cold, almost cutting, and she could sense that working with him again would not be easy, but she'd made a promise to herself and to her mother to rise above the negativity. "Yes, Mom," she replied, her voice calm and professional. She headed down the sterile corridor toward room 209, her footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet hall. As she neared the door, Angela took a deep breath to center herself. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would handle them with grace. Inside room 209, she found Dr. Greaves standing by the bed, clipboard in hand, his posture rigid and his face as impassive as ever. He barely glanced at her as she entered, his attention focused on the patient's chart. "Good morning, Dr. Greaves," Angela greeted, keeping her tone steady. He nodded curtly, his eyes still on the clipboard. "Ms. Parker, this is Mr. Thomas Edwards. He's recovering from a minor surgery and will be staying with us for a few days. You'll be handling his vitals, medication, and any other necessary care." He finally looked up, fixing her with a critical gaze. "I trust you'll be able to manage this." Angela met his gaze without wavering. "Of course, Dr. Greaves." "Good," he replied, his tone indicating he expected nothing less. Without further acknowledgement, he turned back to his notes and murmured, almost to himself, "St. Mary's has high standards, Ms. Parker. We expect all our staff to uphold them." Angela took her position by Mr. Edwards' bedside, noting the older man's warm brown eyes that, though tired, were bright and watchful. He was dressed in a simple hospital gown, and the hint of a smile played at the corners of his lips as he studied her. It was clear he had overheard the exchange between her and Dr. Greaves. "You must be the new nurse," Mr. Edwards said, his voice soft but resonant, carrying a gentle authority. "Yes, I am," Angela replied with a smile. "Angela Parker. I'll be taking care of you today, Mr. Edwards." "Thomas," he corrected, his smile widening. "Just call me Thomas." Angela nodded, sensing that he was no ordinary patient. There was a subtle gravitas about him, a quiet confidence that set him apart. As she checked his vitals and adjusted his IV, Thomas watched her with a perceptive gaze, as though he could see beyond her polite smile to the layers of effort and determination beneath. Dr. Greaves, meanwhile, stood at the end of the bed, checking his watch periodically and barely acknowledging either of them. Finally, he spoke, addressing Angela without looking up from his notes. "Ms. Parker, please ensure that Mr. Edwards receives his medication precisely on schedule. No delays." He then directed his gaze toward Thomas. "And if you need anything, Mr. Edwards, please don't hesitate to inform me or any of our experienced staff." The emphasis on the word experienced was subtle, but it wasn't lost on Angela. She clenched her jaw, choosing not to respond. Instead, she focused on finishing her tasks with the utmost precision, determined to show Dr. Greaves that she was more than capable. As Dr. Greaves left the room, Angela felt a strange sense of relief, the tension dissipating as his presence faded. Thomas observed her in silence, his expression thoughtful. "You handled that well," he remarked, his tone calm but approving. Angela smiled slightly. "Thank you. It's only my second day here, but I've learned quickly that not everyone is as welcoming as I'd hoped." Thomas chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Hospitals like this tend to have certain expectations, but I wouldn't let people like Dr. Greaves get to you. You have a strong spirit, Angela. Don't let anyone dim it." Angela was taken aback by his insight. She hadn't expected such kindness from a patient, let alone one who seemed so aware of her situation. But she appreciated his words, feeling a small spark of encouragement. "Thank you, Thomas," she replied quietly. "I'll keep that in mind." As Angela continued her rounds that day, she found herself thinking back to her conversation with Thomas. There was something about him that felt familiar, as if she'd known him longer than just a few hours. His words stayed with her, giving her the strength to brush off the cold stares and quiet whispers she encountered in the halls. By afternoon, it was time for Angela's break, and she found herself gravitating toward the hospital's small garden courtyard, a serene spot surrounded by a wall of ivy and shaded by a large oak tree. She sat down on a bench, letting the cool breeze wash over her, grateful for a moment of peace. Her moment of solitude was interrupted, however, by the sound of approaching footsteps. She looked up to see Dr. Greaves standing nearby, his gaze fixed on her with a look that was both disapproving and scrutinizing. "Miss Parker," he began, his tone carrying a familiar edge, "I noticed you took a bit longer than usual with Mr. Edwards earlier. This isn't a place for idle conversations." Angela felt a surge of frustration, but kept her expression neutral. "I was just ensuring that Mr. Edwards was comfortable. Dr. Greaves, building rapport with patients can be beneficial for their recovery." The patient who knew too much. Angela began her third day at St. Mary's with an uneasy mix of anticipation and dread. Her brief exchange with Patricia Monroe and Dr. Greaves the previous day still echoed in her mind, their subtle yet pointed criticisms stinging more than she cared to admit. She had done everything expected of her and more, but it was never enough to satisfy Dr. Greaves' relentless scrutiny. As she stepped into room 209, she was greeted by the now familiar sight of Thomas Edwards sitting up in bed, a gentle smile on his face. "Well, good morning, Angela," he said warmly, his eyes crinkling with that rare blend of kindness and wisdom. "Good morning, Thomas. How are you feeling today?" Angela asked, her voice soft but cheery as she adjusted the settings on his IV drip. "Better than expected," he replied, watching her intently as she worked. "You know, you have a gift, Angela. The way you care for people. It's rare." Angela looked up, touched by his words. "Thank you, Thomas. I try to treat everyone with respect and compassion, no matter the situation." He chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "Not many in this place can say the same. They may wear white coats, but I can tell you, they don't all have white hearts." Angela's smile faded as she considered his words. She wondered if Thomas had observed some of the subtle, unspoken dynamics that played out among the staff. "I appreciate you saying that," she said, feeling a sense of solidarity with this patient who seemed to understand her struggles more deeply than most. Thomas leaned back against his pillow, regarding her thoughtfully. "Tell me, Angela, do you plan to stay here for a long time?" Angela paused, considering the question. "I hope so. St. Mary's has a good reputation, and I'd like to build my career here, if they let me." Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Well, they'd be foolish to lose someone like you." Angela offered him a grateful smile before making her way to the door, ready to continue her rounds. Just as she was about to leave, Thomas's voice stopped her. "Angela," he said, his tone a touch more serious, "be careful with Dr. Greaves. He may have a polished exterior, but there's more to him than meets the eye." Angela turned, surprised by the warning. "What do you mean?" Thomas's face softened, but there was a glint of caution in his eyes. "Let's just say that Dr. Greaves values control above all else. Anyone he can't control, well, they don't tend to last long here." The words lingered in Angela's mind as she left the room, casting a shadow over her day. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself that Thomas's warning was well-meant but probably unfounded. Still, there was something in his tone that she couldn't ignore. As Angela continued her rounds, she noticed that the tension between her and the other staff members was becoming more overt. It was as though her interactions with Thomas had marked her as different, as someone not to be trusted. Conversations would halt as she entered the room, only to resume in hushed voices as she left. Even Patricia Monroe, who had been professional if somewhat distant, now seemed to watch her with a more critical eye. During her lunch break, Angela found herself in the courtyard once again, seeking solace in the quiet sanctuary beneath the sprawling oak tree. She closed her eyes, letting the cool breeze calm her thoughts. She wished she could talk to someone about what she was going through, but she couldn't risk showing vulnerability in a place where any sign of weakness could be exploited. Just as she was beginning to relax, she felt a presence beside her. Opening her eyes, she was surprised to see Thomas, leaning on a cane as he made his way to the bench beside her. She quickly stood to help him, but he waved her off with a gentle smile. "Don't worry about me, Angela. I may be old, but I'm not fragile," he said, settling himself onto the bench with a soft grunt. "Thomas, what are you doing out here?" she asked, glancing around. Patients didn't often wander the grounds without a staff member present, and she couldn't help but wonder if he had slipped away from his room unnoticed. "I needed some fresh air," he replied, looking up at the canopy of leaves overhead. "The walls in there start to feel like they're closing in on you after a while." Angela nodded in understanding. "I get that. Sometimes it feels like the whole hospital is pressing down on me too." Thomas turned to her, his gaze piercing. "You're carrying a heavy burden, Angela, but you don't have to do it alone." A subtle revolt begins. Angela's days at St. Mary's continued to unfold in a rhythm of careful diligence. Despite the undercurrent of hostility from Dr. Greaves and the occasional cold shoulder from her colleagues, she had found ways to focus on her work and draw strength from the small victories each day. But there was one thing that continued to surprise her: the quiet but consistent presence of Thomas Edwards. It was as if he had taken her under his wing, watching her, listening to her, and gently encouraging her resilience with his words and gestures. One morning, as she prepared to begin her rounds, Angela was summoned to the head nurse's office. She assumed it would be another stern reminder from Patricia Monroe to stay in line, but when she arrived, she found not only Patricia but also Thomas Edwards, sitting calmly beside her. Angela felt a flicker of confusion. Patients rarely entered administrative spaces, and yet Thomas was here, his posture relaxed, but his gaze as perceptive as ever. "Ms. Parker," Patricia began, her tone clipped as usual, "Mr. Edwards here has requested a transfer to your care specifically." Angela glanced at Thomas, who offered her an encouraging smile. Her heart swelled at the show of confidence from him. "Mr. Edwards has expressed to the board that he would like you to be his primary nurse for the remainder of his stay," Patricia continued, her expression unreadable. "This is an unusual request, but given Mr. Edwards' circumstances, we have agreed to accommodate him." Angela struggled to contain her surprise. "Thank you, Ms. Monroe. I'm honored that Mr. Edwards would like me to be his nurse." Patricia nodded, looking less than pleased. "Very well. But keep in mind, Ms. Parker, this does not mean you are exempt from your other duties. St. Mary's expects excellence from every member of its staff." "Yes, of course," Angela replied, keeping her voice steady. Once the meeting concluded, Angela and Thomas left the office together, making their way down the hallway. Angela turned to him, her curiosity finally getting the better of her. "Thomas, how did you manage that?" she asked, her voice low. "I didn't think patients had much say over who cared for them here." Thomas chuckled, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "I have my ways, Angela. I may look like an old man, but I still know how to make my voice heard." As they walked, she noticed that several staff members were watching them, their expressions varying from surprise to barely concealed irritation. The notion of a patient making specific requests, and of those requests being honored, was unusual, perhaps even unprecedented at St. Mary's. It was a small victory, but one that made Angela feel seen, as though Thomas was giving her a subtle nod of encouragement amid the resistance she encountered every day. Later that day, while Angela was organizing Thomas's medications in his room, she heard a knock at the door. To her surprise, it was Dr. Greaves, his face as impassive as ever. He stepped inside, his gaze flicking from Thomas to Angela with a critical eye. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves began smoothly, "I understand you've requested Ms. Parker to be your primary nurse. I hope you understand that our hospital operates on strict protocols, and it's essential that all staff members maintain a standard of professionalism." Thomas looked up at him calmly, unfazed by Dr. Greaves' tone. "I'm well aware of that, Doctor," he replied, his voice steady. "In fact, I specifically chose Ms. Parker because of her professionalism and dedication." Dr. Greaves's mouth tightened, his gaze narrowing slightly. "I see. Well, as long as you're satisfied. I trust Ms. Parker will continue to adhere to hospital policies." Angela nodded, meeting Dr. Greaves's gaze directly. "Of course, Dr. Greaves. I'm fully committed to providing the highest standard of care." With a curt nod, Dr. Greaves turned and left, but Angela could feel the chill in the room even after he'd gone. She let out a slow breath, her fingers gripping the edge of Thomas's bedside table. "I didn't mean to put you in an uncomfortable position," Thomas said quietly, his eyes filled with understanding. Angela shook her head, a wry smile on her lips. "No, I appreciate it. It's just unusual having someone speak up for me in a place like this." A subtle revolt begins. Angela's days at St. Mary's continued to unfold in a rhythm of careful diligence. Despite the undercurrent of hostility from Dr. Greaves and the occasional cold shoulder from her colleagues, she had found ways to focus on her work and draw strength from the small victories each day. But there was one thing that continued to surprise her: the quiet but consistent presence of Thomas Edwards. It was as if he had taken her under his wing, watching her, listening to her, and gently encouraging her resilience with his words and gestures. One morning, as she prepared to begin her rounds, Angela was summoned to the head nurse's office. She assumed it would be another stern reminder from Patricia Monroe to stay in line, but when she arrived, she found not only Patricia but also Thomas Edwards, sitting calmly beside her. Angela felt a flicker of confusion. Patients rarely entered administrative spaces, and yet Thomas was here, his posture relaxed, but his gaze as perceptive as ever. "Ms. Parker," Patricia began, her tone clipped as usual, "Mr. Edwards here has requested a transfer to your care specifically." Angela glanced at Thomas, who offered her an encouraging smile. Her heart swelled at the show of confidence from him. "Mr. Edwards has expressed to the board that he would like you to be his primary nurse for the remainder of his stay," Patricia continued, her expression unreadable. "This is an unusual request, but given Mr. Edwards' circumstances, we have agreed to accommodate him." Angela struggled to contain her surprise. "Thank you, Ms. Monroe. I'm honored that Mr. Edwards would like me to be his nurse." Patricia nodded, looking less than pleased. "Very well. But keep in mind, Ms. Parker, this does not mean you are exempt from your other duties. St. Mary's expects excellence from every member of its staff." "Yes, of course," Angela replied, keeping her voice steady. Once the meeting concluded, Angela and Thomas left the office together, making their way down the hallway. Angela turned to him, her curiosity finally getting the better of her. "Thomas, how did you manage that?" she asked, her voice low. "I didn't think patients had much say over who cared for them here." Thomas chuckled, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "I have my ways, Angela. I may look like an old man, but I still know how to make my voice heard." As they walked, she noticed that several staff members were watching them, their expressions varying from surprise to barely concealed irritation. The notion of a patient making specific requests, and of those requests being honored, was unusual, perhaps even unprecedented at St. Mary's. It was a small victory, but one that made Angela feel seen, as though Thomas was giving her a subtle nod of encouragement amid the resistance she encountered every day. Later that day, while Angela was organizing Thomas's medications in his room, she heard a knock at the door. To her surprise, it was Dr. Greaves, his face as impassive as ever. He stepped inside, his gaze flicking from Thomas to Angela with a critical eye. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves began smoothly, "I understand you've requested Ms. Parker to be your primary nurse. I hope you understand that our hospital operates on strict protocols, and it's essential that all staff members maintain a standard of professionalism." Thomas looked up at him calmly, unfazed by Dr. Greaves' tone. "I'm well aware of that, Doctor," he replied, his voice steady. "In fact, I specifically chose Ms. Parker because of her professionalism and dedication." Dr. Greaves's mouth tightened, his gaze narrowing slightly. "I see. Well, as long as you're satisfied. I trust Ms. Parker will continue to adhere to hospital policies. Angela nodded, meeting Dr. Greaves's gaze directly. Of course, Dr. Greaves. I'm fully committed to providing the highest standard of care. With a curt nod, Dr. Greaves turned and left, but Angela could feel the chill in the room even after he'd gone. She let out a slow breath, her fingers gripping the edge of Thomas's bedside table. I didn't mean to put you in an uncomfortable position, Thomas said quietly, his eyes filled with understanding. Angela shook her head, a wry smile on her lips. No, I appreciate it. It's just unusual having someone speak up for me in a place like this. Thomas nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. Angela, you're doing important work here, more important than they realize. Sometimes people need a reminder that they can't take you for granted. Angela felt a swell of gratitude. In Thomas, she had found not only an ally but also a mentor of sorts, someone who understood the quiet battles she fought each day. And as it turned out, Thomas wasn't just a passive observer. He had a plan. A few days later, an unexpected event shook the daily rhythm of the hospital. A high-profile group from the hospital's board of directors arrived unannounced, their visit sending ripples of excitement and unease throughout the staff. Rumors flew around, with everyone speculating about the purpose of the visit. Angela noticed the tense expressions on the faces of her colleagues as she went about her duties. Most of them scrambled to ensure that every corner of their departments was spotless, and the usual quiet tones of the hospital were replaced by a hurried sense of urgency. Dr. Greaves was particularly on edge, barking orders at anyone within earshot, his usual cold composure slipping as he tried to impress the board members. To Angela's surprise, one of the directors, a tall man with a kind face and graying hair, made his way directly to room 209, where Thomas was resting. She was in the middle of checking Thomas's vitals when the man entered, his face lighting up as he saw Thomas. "Thomas," he exclaimed, reaching out to shake his hand. "It's been too long." Thomas broke into a smile, his whole face softening. "Mark, I didn't expect to see you here today." Angela watched in amazement as the two men exchanged greetings, their familiarity clear. Thomas had mentioned he had connections, but she hadn't realized just how far-reaching they were. After a few moments, Thomas turned to Angela, gesturing to her with pride. "Mark, this is Angela Parker. She's been taking excellent care of me. I specifically requested her." Mark looked at Angela with genuine interest, extending a hand. "Ms. Parker, it's a pleasure to meet you. Thomas has spoken very highly of you." Angela shook his hand, feeling the surge of gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored to work with Mr. Edwards." Mark nodded approvingly before turning back to Thomas, his expression growing serious. "Thomas, you called us here. What's on your mind?" Angela watched as Thomas's face hardened, his easygoing demeanor giving way to a steely determination. "There are issues here, Mark. Issues that go beyond what most people see. I've experienced firsthand the double standards and prejudices within these walls. But more than that, I've seen Angela and others like her treated as if they're somehow less deserving of respect and support." Angela felt her breath catch. She had known Thomas was a man of influence, but hearing him speak out so boldly about the injustices she faced left her speechless. Mark listened intently, nodding as Thomas continued. "This hospital has a stellar reputation, but there are systemic issues that need to be addressed. Staff members like Angela are pushed to the limits, held to impossible standards, and treated with condescension by those who should be mentoring them." Mark's expression turned thoughtful, and he glanced at Angela with a look that was both empathetic and assessing. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Thomas. We'll be conducting a thorough evaluation of the staff, including Dr. Greaves and others." Angela felt a thrill of hope. For the first time since she'd started at St. Mary's, she sensed that her struggles might be seen and acknowledged. As Mark and the board members moved through the hospital, she noticed Dr. Greaves's growing agitation. His forced smiles and tense posture betrayed his discomfort under the scrutiny, and she felt a glimmer of satisfaction, knowing that he was being held accountable for his behavior. The following week brought a shift in the hospital's atmosphere. Dr. Greaves's tone softened slightly, his usual criticisms tempered by the awareness that he was being observed. Angela noticed that her workload had become slightly more balanced, with fewer of the grueling back-to-back assignments she previously shouldered alone. One afternoon, she caught sight of Dr. Greaves in the hallway, his gaze flicking toward her before quickly looking away. He seemed almost wary, as though she'd become a person of significance, someone whose presence he could no longer overlook. It was a small but empowering change, a reminder that the tides were beginning to turn. Thomas remained her greatest supporter, encouraging her and offering insights that deepened her understanding of the dynamics at play. She came to realize that he was not only a patient, but also a quiet revolutionary, someone who knew how to navigate power structures and use them to advocate for justice. As the days passed, Angela felt her confidence grow, bolstered by Thomas's unwavering faith in her abilities. She was no longer just enduring her time at St. Mary's. She was actively reclaiming her space within it. And though she still faced challenges, she knew that she wasn't alone, that she had an ally in Thomas and a newfound strength that would see her through. Little did she know, however, that the subtle revolt sparked by Thomas's influence would soon escalate, forcing everyone at St. Mary's to confront the biases and injustices that had long been hidden behind its polished facade. The ripples of change were spreading, and Angela was at the heart of it all. Seeds of change unraveling. The following days at St. Mary's brought an unexpected shift. The usual hum of efficient whispers and hushed judgments had quieted, replaced by a palpable tension that radiated from the higher-ups to the junior staff. Dr. Greaves, usually a looming and condescending presence, seemed preoccupied and tense, his gaze darting around the hospital as though he were constantly on the lookout. Rumors had begun circulating among the staff, whispers about an investigation, a call from the board, and a memo that had circulated overnight urging all staff members to observe the highest standards of respect and professionalism. Angela couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas's influence was working in ways she had only begun to understand. Despite the small victories and newfound support she'd begun to experience, she remained cautious, aware that the changes might be temporary or even cosmetic. She knew that deeply rooted issues didn't disappear overnight. One afternoon, as she was conducting her rounds, she noticed a familiar figure waiting by the nurse's station. Thomas Edwards, impeccably dressed in a sharp suit, leaned casually against the counter, chatting with Patricia Monroe, whose usual stern demeanor seemed softened in his presence. Angela hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but Thomas spotted her and gave her an encouraging nod. "Angela," he called, waving her over. "There you are. I was just asking Ms. Monroe about the progress being made on the evaluation the board had called for. She tells me it's underway." Angela approached, casting a curious glance between them. "Evaluation," she echoed, her voice laced with curiosity and cautious hope. Thomas nodded, his face calm but serious. "The board has taken a particular interest in the dynamics here. They want to ensure that all staff members are being treated fairly and that the standards of respect are being upheld, regardless of background." He turned to Patricia, his gaze unyielding. "It's important, don't you think, Ms. Monroe?" Patricia, caught in Thomas's steady gaze, nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Edwards. We all take these matters seriously. We want St. Mary's to be a place of integrity and respect." Angela could tell that Patricia's words, though polite, were tinged with a nervousness she rarely displayed. Patricia's normally unwavering authority seemed shaken, and Angela could almost see the gears turning behind her eyes. The reputation of St. Mary's, it seemed, was now under scrutiny, and the pressure to maintain a spotless image was pressing on the administration in new ways. Thomas placed a reassuring hand on Angela's shoulder. "I trust Angela here has been a great example of those standards. She's shown nothing but dedication and grace, even under less than ideal circumstances." Patricia managed a tight smile, her expression neutral but strained. "Yes, of course. Miss Parker is an asset to our team." As Patricia excused herself, Angela glanced up at Thomas, a mix of gratitude and caution in her gaze. "Thank you, Thomas. I can't believe how much you're doing for me." Thomas gave her a warm smile, his voice gentle. "Angela, I'm not just doing this for you. There are others here who deserve the same respect, the same fair treatment. You're just one of the few brave enough to face it head-on." His expression grew serious. "Don't forget that your courage has already made a difference. Keep standing your ground." With a nod, Thomas headed toward the hospital's main entrance, his presence leaving a lingering sense of encouragement in his wake. Angela watched him go, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the changes taking place at St. Mary's weren't happening solely because of Thomas. Her actions, her resilience, and her refusal to be silenced had laid the groundwork for this moment. As the day progressed, Angela began noticing subtle but unmistakable changes in how she was treated by her colleagues. Some of the nurses who had once given her the cold shoulder now greeted her with polite nods. The same people who had whispered behind her back now seemed wary, their eyes averted when they passed her in the hall. Dr. Greaves, in particular, appeared to be on edge. His sharp tone softened, his usual criticisms restrained as though he were acutely aware of being watched. It wasn't long before Angela's newfound reputation reached beyond the walls of her department. Word had spread about the investigation, and even staff members from other wings approached her with tentative smiles or quiet words of encouragement. It was a surreal experience, one she never could have imagined on her first day at St. Mary's. Though it was still a battle every day, she began to feel that she wasn't entirely alone. That evening, as her shift wound down, Angela decided to take a moment to visit the staff lounge, hoping to unwind before her bus ride home. She poured herself a cup of coffee, savoring the quiet when she heard a soft voice behind her. "Angela." Turning, she saw a younger nurse, Rachel, whom she'd only spoken to briefly before. Rachel was a soft-spoken woman with a reserved demeanor, one who rarely mingled with the other nurses. Angela remembered seeing her dart through hallways, keeping her head down, and she had always sensed a quiet strength within her. "Yes, Rachel," Angela replied, giving her a welcoming smile. Rachel glanced around as if ensuring they were alone, before speaking in a hushed tone. I wanted to thank you. I've noticed how hard things have been for you here, and I can see that you've stood your ground, even when things got tough." Angela was surprised by the words that touched. "Thank you, Rachel. That means a lot. It hasn't been easy, but it helps knowing that others are paying attention." Rachel nodded, her expression earnest. "I've been here for a couple of years, and I know how people like Dr. Greaves operate. They pick on anyone who doesn't fit their mold. I've faced my own challenges, and seeing you stand up has given me courage." Angela felt a surge of solidarity. "Thank you, Rachel. We're stronger together. Don't let them silence you." Rachel gave her a quick smile before ducking out of the lounge, and Angela was left with a growing sense of hope. Thomas's influence had sparked something more profound than just an evaluation. The undercurrent of fear that had governed the hospital was beginning to shift into something new, a current of quiet, building courage. The next day brought a surprise that Angela could hardly believe. As she entered the lobby to begin her shift, she saw a group of board members standing in front of a small podium, surrounded by members of the hospital staff. Dr. Greaves stood nearby, his face a mask of composure, though Angela could see the tension in his jaw. The board chairman, a tall woman with an air of authority, spoke into the microphone, her voice echoing through the lobby. "We've been conducting a comprehensive review of St. Mary's policies and practices," she announced. "In our commitment to excellence, we expect every staff member to uphold the highest standards of respect, integrity, and professionalism." Angela felt her heart quicken. This announcement was a direct result of the actions she and Thomas had taken, a ripple effect that had now reached the highest levels of the institution. The chairman continued, her gaze sweeping over the gathered staff. "Our mission is not only to care for patients, but to create an environment of respect and fairness for every individual here. We are committed to ensuring that Street Mary's remains a place where everyone, regardless of background, feels valued and respected." As she finished, the gathered crowd murmured, glancing at one another with a mix of surprise and curiosity. Dr. Greaves, whose face was now flushed, caught Angela's gaze for a fleeting moment, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Angela sensed that he was beginning to understand the impact of his actions, that his power was no longer unquestioned. In the days that followed, Angela noticed that the environment at Street Mary's had shifted in subtle but significant ways. Patricia Monroe was more cordial, her tone softened when giving Angela instructions, as though aware of the eyes that were now watching her every move. Dr. Greaves, meanwhile, became a figure of hushed conversations, his reputation now overshadowed by the scrutiny of the board. Thomas, though nearing his discharge date, remained Angela's steadfast supporter. They shared quiet conversations during her rounds, his words of encouragement a balm that kept her spirits high. On his last day, he handed her a small card with his contact information, his gaze warm and sincere. "If you ever need anything, Angela," he said, "don't hesitate to reach out. And remember, what you're doing here is more important than you know." Angela accepted the card, her heart heavy with gratitude. "Thank you, Thomas. You've done so much for me already." Thomas shook his head. "I just gave you a little nudge. The strength was always yours." As he left Street Mary's, Angela felt both sadness and an overwhelming sense of pride. She had gained an ally, a mentor, and perhaps most importantly, a renewed belief in her own worth. The seeds of change he had helped plant were now taking root, bringing to life a new culture within the hospital, one that valued fairness, integrity, and respect. That night, Angela left the hospital with a lighter heart, her mother's words echoing in her mind. "Remember who you are, and don't let them make you feel less." She had withstood the storm, and in doing so, had become a force for change. As she boarded the bus home, she couldn't help but smile, feeling a peace that had once seemed impossible. Street Mary's was different now, and so was she. A quiet revolution had begun, and Angela knew she would continue to fight for what was right, one small victory at a time. A legacy of change. The days following Thomas Edwards' departure from Street Mary's felt surreal to Angela, as though the air in the hospital had lightened. In the weeks since the board's announcement, subtle but undeniable changes had begun to sweep through the hospital, reshaping the very foundation of its culture. And although Angela knew the road was far from over, the small victories she witnessed each day reminded her of the power of persistence, unity, and quiet strength. With Thomas gone, Angela often felt his absence acutely. The encouragement he'd offered her, his calm wisdom, and the hope he'd infused into her otherwise daunting days had become an anchor she hadn't realized she depended on. But she'd kept the small card he'd given her tucked into her wallet, a tangible reminder of his support. One afternoon, as she was finishing her rounds, she noticed Rachel, the soft-spoken nurse who had confided in her weeks before. Rachel approached her with a nervous smile, holding a folder of patient records close to her chest. "Angela," she began quietly, glancing around the corridor, "I wanted to thank you again. Things have changed since you stood up. I feel like I can finally do my job without constantly looking over my shoulder." Angela smiled, feeling a swell of pride. "You have every right to feel that way, Rachel. We all do." Rachel nodded, her expression becoming more earnest. "But it's because of you. You inspired us. I was always too scared to say anything, but seeing you handle everything, it showed me that I didn't have to accept things as they were." Before Angela could respond, Rachel gently squeezed her arm, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you for being brave for us. You've made a difference here." Rachel's words lingered in Angela's mind long after they parted. For years, Angela had fought quietly, expecting no recognition or reward, driven only by her sense of duty and the belief that her work mattered. But now, as she walked through the halls of Street Mary's, she saw proof that her efforts hadn't been in vain. Colleagues who once regarded her with suspicion or indifference now greeted her with respect. Nurses who had kept their heads down were now standing a bit taller, speaking a bit more confidently, no longer afraid to be seen. That evening, as she returned to the staff lounge, Angela noticed a small envelope waiting for her in her mailbox. Curious, she opened it to find a handwritten letter. Her heart raced as she recognized the neat, looping handwriting. It was from Thomas Edwards. Dear Angela, I trust this letter finds you well. By now, I am sure that the changes we set in motion are beginning to bear fruit. I may no longer be at Street Mary's, but I want you to know that I am still with you in spirit, cheering you on from afar. What you've done, what you've stood for, has ignited something far more significant than either of us could have imagined. Change is like a seed. It grows slowly at first, hidden beneath the soil. But with time, it breaks through the surface, reaching for the sun. You, Angela, are that seed. You've grown in a place that wasn't ready for you, and yet you've risen anyway, stretching toward the light despite every obstacle in your path. I have watched you with pride, not just as a nurse, but as a person who embodies integrity and courage. You've brought humanity back into those sterile halls, reminded everyone what it means to care. For that, I am grateful, and I am proud to have had even a small part in your journey. Remember, the work is far from over. The world needs more people like you, who are unafraid to stand up for what's right, even in the face of adversity. And though I may not be there to see it, I know you will continue to be a light for those around you. Thank you, Angela, for inspiring me too. Yours always, Thomas Edwards. Angela's hands trembled slightly as she finished reading the letter, a lump forming in her throat. She closed her eyes, letting Thomas's words sink in. His message wasn't just a farewell, it was a call to action, a reminder that her fight was part of a greater purpose. She'd never realized how much her actions mattered, how her quiet strength had rippled out to those around her. But now, with Thomas's encouragement, she felt a renewed resolve. Over the following months, Angela poured herself into her work with a new sense of purpose. She became a mentor to junior nurses, sharing her insights, encouraging them to speak up, and advocating for a fairer, more supportive environment. When Dr. Greaves attempted to undermine her, she responded with calm professionalism, refusing to be rattled by his barely veiled antagonism. His influence, once so overwhelming, had begun to fade in the wake of the board's scrutiny and Angela's growing reputation. The investigation initiated by the board continued, bringing with it a series of reforms. Policies were implemented to address issues of workplace bias and fairness, and the hospital's administration became more accessible, establishing an anonymous reporting system for staff. Dr. Greaves, once the untouchable figure in the hospital, was no longer immune to accountability. After a review, he was reassigned to a less visible role. His power over others significantly diminished. In the wake of these changes, Angela found herself more connected to her colleagues. Nurses who once avoided eye contact now sought her advice, and even Patricia Monroe, the head nurse, had softened, her once icy demeanor now showing hints of respect for Angela's resilience. One evening, Angela received an unexpected call from Mark, the board member who had visited Thomas during his stay at Street Mary's. Angela, he greeted warmly, his voice filled with genuine respect. I wanted to let you know that the board has been following your progress. We're impressed by the changes you've helped bring about at Street Mary's. Thank you, sir, Angela replied, her voice tinged with humility. I've only done what I felt was right. Well, Mark continued, we believe that Street Mary's needs more people like you, people who understand that true care extends beyond the patients to the entire hospital environment. We're working on implementing similar policies in other facilities, and we'd love for you to serve as a consultant to guide these changes. Angela's breath caught. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. I'd be honored, sir, she replied. feeling the weight of the responsibility, but also the thrill of knowing her efforts were expanding beyond the walls of Street Mary's. After ending the call, Angela sat in silence, reflecting on how much had changed. What began as a quiet struggle had grown into a movement of respect, fairness, and accountability. And though she missed Thomas's presence, she knew he would be proud. As the weeks turned into months, Angela's role as a nurse and a mentor continued to grow. The staff lounge, once a place of whispered judgments, had become a space where ideas and support flourished. Younger nurses no longer felt the need to hide their questions or concerns, and Angela's door was always open for anyone seeking advice. On her last evening shift of the year, Angela found herself alone in the quiet halls, the soft hum of monitors and the steady beep of machines her only companions. She walked through the empty corridors, her mind tracing back over her journey, the countless challenges, and the friends and allies she had found along the way. Reaching her locker, she pulled out her wallet, unfolding the small card Thomas had given her. She held it for a moment, whispering a quiet thank you, knowing that without him, this transformation might never have begun. In that quiet moment, Angela felt a profound peace settle over her. She knew that her work was far from over, that her fight for respect and equality was part of a greater legacy. But she was ready, fueled by the resilience she had discovered within herself and the courage she had inspired in others. As she left Street Mary's that night, stepping out into the crisp evening air, Angela looked up at the stars and smiled. She was no longer just a nurse fighting a lonely battle. She was part of a legacy, a beacon of change, and a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could spark a revolution.